Hi, my name is Juliet Selgren, and this is my podcast, The Great Antidote. This podcast has been brought to you by the Center for Growth and Opportunity at Utah State University. To learn more, visit www.thecgo.org. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Matthew Feeney. He is the director of Cato's project on emerging technologies, where he works on issues concerning the intersection of new technologies and civil liberties. It's my pleasure to have you on today to dive deeper into the incredibly misunderstood Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which sounds kind of complicated, kind of geeky, but basically it's why the internet is great. It's the reason why we have food reviews and we can shop and we can buy stuff and we can watch movies and all that stuff. And recently I spoke with Tom Hazlett about the issue, and he suggested that I speak to an expert on this topic. So that's what this podcast is going to be about. Welcome.
Well, thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
So before we jump in, I want to ask you a question that I ask all my guests, which is, what is the most important thing that people my age should know that we don't?
It's a very good question, and in preparation for the podcast, I actually took a look at some of the previous podcasts you've recorded with some friends and colleagues of mine, as well as some people that I admire. And I thought that a lot of them had advice that I would have given, or had advice that was better than something I'd ever thought of. So I liked, Andrea O'Sullivan on compound interest was very good. But I think along those lines, I mean, there's a lot of things that people who are older than you will say that's not particularly original or interesting. But I thought one that I wish more people had told me when I was your age is, and it will sound simple, but it's I think a healthy piece of advice, which is, if you can't afford it, don't buy it. And I think there are a lot of people in life who get themselves in trouble with debt and financial responsibility, and that's something I wish more people had told me.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that I struggle with because, with technology and stuff, every single store I could ever think of is at the touch of a few buttons, at the tip of my fingers. Like, I could just buy thousands of dollars of random things I definitely don't need and can't afford. So I
Mm-hmm.
think it's really good advice. It's very, for me, but also I think just for everyone to know that. I think everyone could benefit from that advice. So that's a good answer.
Thank you.
So on to Section 230. It's in the Communications Decency Act, and if you could explain what that is a little bit. And also, there's some 26 words in there which make up Section 230,
Mm-hmm.
which are called the words that created the internet by people who know them.
Right.
So can you tell us about the history of it and why it's so important?
Right. I think it's really important for people thinking about this piece of legislation to consider where it comes from. And it didn't come from a vacuum. And the crux of the issue is who should bear responsibility for what they say or publish. And I promise I won't do this on just year on year. It won't take forever. But I think it's important to consider a case that the Supreme Court heard long, long before the internet and before Section 230, which is Smith v. California. And this was a case decided in the 1950s by the Supreme Court, where the court had to consider whether an obscenity law from California violated the First Amendment. And this was an important case because a bookstore owner was suing because he'd been found in violation of this obscenity ordinance. He ran a bookstore, but he hadn't read the book at issue. He just put it into the bookshelf. And the Supreme Court said, well, actually, because this was someone's bookstore and he was just selling books and didn't know what was in them, this ordinance violates the the due process clause of the 14th Amendment, and that's important because this kind of discussion about who should be responsible for what's published or written becomes a real problem with the emergence of the internet. And if you jump forward to, say, 1991, you have a case dealing with a company called CompuServe, which I certainly don't remember ever using, and I'm sure, of course, you don't. But this is one of these old companies at the birth of the internet, an internet service provider where you could buy a subscription to CompuServe and you could access the internet, and you could also access a lot of bulletins and newsletters and things like this. And CompuServe did not really engage in much content moderation of a lot of the newsletters on there, and it was only a matter of time before these accusations of defamation arose. So there was a newsletter called Rumorville, and there was a company called Cubby that claimed that there was defamation about them on Rumorville, and this ends up in a court case. And the court here actually said, well, this is, CompuServe is just kind of like the electronic equivalent of a newsstand or a public library. And we don't say that whoever runs a newsstand or who owns the library is liable for any defamation that are in the books or newspapers. And that was a court case from 91. But then a few years later, in 1995, there's a court case that deals with the company that's featured in The Wolf of Wall Street, which might be a movie some of the listeners have watched. And there, what was interesting is it was dealing with an allegation of defamation, but it was on Prodigy, not CompuServe. And Prodigy was another one of these companies that allowed access to certain internet fora. And here the judge said, well, actually, because Prodigy, unlike CompuServe, actually engages in content moderation, they had software that screened for certain words, and they had rules about what you could and could not say. Therefore, Prodigy became the publisher of third-party content. And this is what gave rise to what's called the moderator's dilemma that Section 230 tries to address. The moderator's dilemma is, well, we could either take an approach like CompuServe, where we don't engage in much content moderation and then we're considered more like distributors, or we could engage in content moderation, but then we'll be deemed publishers potentially. And this is a worry if you think about it, because there's many reasons why websites want to engage in content moderation. There's a lot of legal but awful content out there. There's images of animals being tortured. There's images of murders. There's pornography. There's content that's completely legal, but websites may want to screen. But on the other hand, they can't screen everything in the way that many people would like, because it's just too expensive. Social media, as we know it, would not be possible if imagine a Facebook where a lawyer had to screen every single Facebook post or event page or comment. I mean, it would be impossible to have the internet as we know it. And so a couple of congressmen in the wake of the Prodigy decision wrote Section 230. And in Section 230, there are two important provisions that are called colloquially the sword and the shield of Section 230. And the 26 words that you mentioned earlier are the shield. And the 26 words just read, no provider or user of an interactive computer service shall be treated as the publisher or speaker of any information provided by another information content provider. And what that means is, if you post something on Twitter, Facebook, or a comment section on a website, you can be held liable for that content, but the owner of the website can't be, or can't be considered the publisher of that. And then the sword section of Section 230 says that websites cannot be held liable for engaging in content moderation. It just emphasizes that websites are free to remove content that they deem to be offensive or obscene, which allows, for example, Facebook and Twitter to say we don't allow pornography or hate speech or images of animal cruelty, those kind of things. And that's Section 230. It emerged out of a couple of court cases from the 90s, and has been described as either the Magna Carta of the internet or the 26 words that created the internet. And I think those are fairly accurate descriptions. It's hard to imagine the modern internet without something like Section 230.
So, can you give us some examples of how Section 230 is allowed for innovations in technology and on the internet? Because it seems like it just protects companies and platforms, but it also allows them to moderate their platform the way that they want. But how does it, or does it even, allow for innovation in that field?
Right. I think it does. And one of the reasons is I think that robust competition is a necessary condition for innovation. You don't want to have a market environment where the same old boring companies just dominate the space. You want there to be an environment where if you're a powerful company like Google or Facebook, you have to worry about competition. And I think Section 230 actually does spur on innovation in an important way, namely that it saves them a lot of upfront costs, which is important, I think, for competition. So anyone who thinks they have a better idea for a social media company or a better search service or something like YouTube is able to try and build that, whether that's in a college dorm room or at a at a lab somewhere. They're able to build that without worrying about hiring lawyers to make sure that every piece of content posted by third parties isn't potentially illegal. And that's very important because I think it saves those who want to compete with market incumbents with a lot of upfront costs. And one of the big worries I have about ongoing calls to amend Section 230 is that it would make market incumbents much, much stronger and harder to compete with.
So, what would the internet look like today if Section 230 had not been included in the Communications Decency Act?
It's hard to answer that question definitively. So I'll give some Section 230 critics uh, a bit of leeway here. I'll say that, look, we don't know for sure, but there are those that argue that absent Section 230, something like it might have emerged anyway, that the courts would have figured all of this out. And as the internet grew, courts would have come up with some kind of set of rulings that would give us something like Section 230. That may be a possibility, but it's far from clear. And in fact, part of the problem I have with arguments like this is we don't know how much innovation and interesting companies would have been sacrificed in those years where the courts tried to figure all this out. But if we take another step back and just think, well, absent this kind of protection, what would the internet look like? It's an internet without social media. It's an internet without comment sections. It's an internet without user posted reviews. And I know that today people like to talk a lot about some of the big name companies that dominate a lot of the internet. So Google, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube. But it's important to emphasize that Section 230 protects websites big and small, and it protects websites that aren't even involved in social media. So it applies to, say, Amazon or Etsy. It applies to Dropbox. There are tons of companies out there that rely on Section 230 but don't get put in the modern day debates, because I think a lot of the modern debates about Section 230 are really focused on social media.
Mm-hmm. Last year, Adam Thier of the Mercatus Center tweeted, quote, "The current debate over Section 230 and online content moderation has been dominated by misinformation, bad reporting, and outright lies," end quote. Can you tell us what the current debate is and what people get wrong about Section 230?
Yeah, that does sound like something Adam would say. Look, I think he's right. It's interesting because oftentimes when you talk to people who are involved in policy, they're in the really unenviable position of trying to explain very dense and complex either court rulings or pieces of legislation. And I feel very lucky, actually, that Section 230 is a relatively short piece of legislation that doesn't use too many big, complicated words. And uh, anyone in the country or anyone in the world who speaks English should be able to read it and get it. But unfortunately, despite that being the case, there do seem to be a number of persistent myths about Section 230 that are worth highlighting. The first is, I think, that there is some kind of important legal distinction between publishers and platforms, and that if you engage in content moderation, you become a publisher. This just is not true. And importantly, I think we should always remember that there are so-called publishers that rely on Section 230. So, for example, the New York Times publishes a newspaper made out of paper, but they also post online. And if you, for example, wrote a op-ed in the New York Times and defamed me, I would be able to sue not only you, but also the New York Times. However, if there was an op-ed on the New York Times and you said the same thing about me in the comments section, then I could sue you, but not the New York Times because of Section 230. That comment section is an interactive computer service covered by Section 230. And that's very important, I think, to keep in mind, which is Section 230 isn't just a thing for social media or even internet companies. There are traditional brick and mortar stores that have websites that also enjoy Section 230 protection. And another piece of mythology that seems to spread around Section 230 is the allegation or the claim that you only get Section 230 protection if you are politically neutral. This has been said by, for example, Senator Ted Cruz, but it is also not true. And it's a particularly common claim these days because one of the most important controversies about Section 230 is the complaints from conservatives about alleged political bias. There's a large section of the American conservative movement these days that is convinced that Google, YouTube, Twitter and Facebook just don't like conservatives and are trying to get rid of a lot of conservative content. And in these debates, you'll sometimes see someone saying, well, if they do that, they don't enjoy Section 230 protection. When in fact, if Mark Zuckerberg woke up tomorrow and said, look, anyone who has ever liked Donald Trump's Facebook page is having their account deleted, it might be a very unwise business decision, but it would be completely legal. On the more left wing of the spectrum, you have many Democrats who are concerned about misinformation, the infiltration of social media by foreign governments, and the spread of harmful and abusive content. So both sides of the political aisle have complaints about Section 230. They're quite different kinds of complaints, but unfortunately, myths about the law spread nonetheless.
I was actually about to ask you about that. So, a lot of what conservatives say is that there is anti-conservative bias and that they're being censored by these platforms, by these companies.
Mm-hmm.
And you wrote a lot about it, including about the claim made by Dennis Prager of Prager University about YouTube and how YouTube discriminates against his videos. Can you tell us what you found?
This is probably the most well-known, or certainly one of the most well-known conservative complaints. Listeners may be familiar with Dennis Prager. He's a conservative commentator who has founded a website called Prager University, which has a associated YouTube channel. And Prager alleged that YouTube was putting a bunch of PragerU videos behind its restricted mode, and that this constituted some kind of First Amendment violation because YouTube should be considered a public forum. Now, there are a couple of problems with the claim, and Prager has lost in both courts where he's tried to make this argument. The first is it's not clear that this is evidence of anti-conservative bias per se. YouTube has something called restricted mode, which users can opt into, and people might opt into this if they are, say, parents with young children, or they're trying to host a business that they want to be family friendly, like a school or a public library. And it just puts certain videos behind a wall. So videos that have images of violence or obscenity, discussions about sex or drug use. And some of PragerU's videos were put behind this wall, and it's not clear, though, that this was done because of an anti-conservative bias. An analysis by the trade association NetChoice found that about 12% of PragerU's videos ended up in this restricted mode, and that compares to something like, I think it was three-quarters of 75% of videos from Young Turks, which is hardly a conservative YouTube channel. So there are a lot of different channels across the political spectrum that find themselves in having videos put into restricted mode. And let's just put to one side that claim. So I don't think Dennis Prager is correct that this is anti-conservative bias, but his next claim, though, is that YouTube is some kind of public forum, and this, I think, is very easy to dismiss. One is YouTube is not a monopoly. There are many places on the internet to go to find videos. In fact, conservatives who were upset about YouTube's supposed censorship went on to start up their own company called BitChute that you can check out. And importantly, though, as the judges made clear in rulings, that the First Amendment is a restriction on government, not private companies. So again, it's even if YouTube issued a press release saying, "Look, we've decided we don't like conservatives very much, and we're going to put all pieces of conservative commentary behind our restricted mode," it would be completely legal for them to do that. It's a private company, and it's not bound by the First Amendment. But unfortunately, something I've discovered in ongoing debates about Section 230 is there seems to be not only widespread confusion about what Section 230 says, but also widespread confusion about what the First Amendment says. And that's worrying for a whole other host of reasons.
So then, why do conservatives feel this way? We have a family friend, well, my family has a family friend who's a mild Trump supporter, and she does get blocked a fair amount, and some of her tweets just don't seem that harmful, that aggressive in any way. And so I can see where she's coming from, especially if her friends also get blocked, people she follows also get blocked, how she could feel discriminated against.
Mm-hmm.
But what is going on? Is there a bigger picture that she's not seeing about everyone on the left who also gets blocked? Or are the reasons she's getting blocked not really relating to, or sorry, are the reasons why she gets blocked so regularly just so small compared to the amount of conservatives and other people who don't get blocked that it's hard to argue that it's discrimination?
It's a good question, and I don't want to comment on your family friend's case particularly, just because I don't know the details. But I'll say the following, which is, if you are convinced that there is some kind of political agenda in Silicon Valley, I would suggest that you go on a hunt for complaints from your political opponents. At the moment, we're used to hearing complaints from conservatives about this kind of treatment, but we shouldn't forget that it was only actually a few years ago where the political left had similar complaints about how Google and Facebook treated socialists or the Black Lives Matter movement, images of police brutality. These complaints come from all across the political spectrum, and one of the features of social media is, I think, it makes it easier for us to isolate ourselves in our ideological bubbles. So if you're on Twitter and you only follow other, say, conservatives on Twitter, and you are hearing a lot about conservatives being so-called shadow banned or booted, and you consider yourself part of that group, it would be very easy to come to the conclusion that there's some kind of crusade against conservatives. But it's important to consider that your political opponents probably have similar complaints. And what does that reveal? I think it reveals something rather important to remember, namely that content moderation is very, very difficult. We shouldn't forget that there are billions and billions of pieces of content posted on social media sites every week. There's something like, I forget the exact figure, but it's something like every minute 400 hours of content are uploaded to YouTube. And there are hundreds of millions of tweets every day. So there will always be false negatives, false positives in any content moderation regime. We should consider that content moderation is very difficult. If you and I, for example, sat down and we wanted to compete with Facebook, we wanted to found our own social media site, you and I would have to come up with a content moderation guide. Images that we wouldn't want to appear, even if they're legal. And you and I might say, look, maybe we should just ban images of child nudity, which sounds like a great rule. But then, and this is a real instance, Facebook had to grapple with a rule like that because someone posted the famous photograph from the Vietnam War of the napalming and a naked young girl running towards the photographer screaming. I would argue it's one of the most iconic images of the 20th century. But
Mhm.
Facebook then had to decide, okay, so do we make a historic significance exception to this rule? If or if an image is famous, we'd somehow exempt it. This kind of stuff is very difficult, and in fact, there are some social media sites that will treat the same content in a different way depending on how it's portrayed. For example, I know it was a few years ago, Facebook they may still have a policy where if you have a video of a child being bullied at school, it's removed if the poster of the video is making fun of the victim. But if an anti-bullying charity posts it, then it stays up. So I think we should all just take a step back and consider that content moderation is very difficult. It's especially difficult at scale. And at scale, we should expect there to be false positives and false negatives. And in an ecosystem as large as Facebook or Twitter, it will be very easy for people to identify instances of supposed bias.
You said that a few years ago the left had similar outcries against being blocked or being suspended on by certain companies on these platforms. So, how is the left feeling about this right now?
The left, I would say, it's difficult to generalize, but I would say the left, many people on the American political left find the ongoing discussion about political bias rather puzzling, because if you're left wing and you're looking at something like YouTube or Facebook or Twitter, it's sort of confusing that conservatives seem to think these are unfriendly companies. That they'll point to popular people like Dennis Prager or Ben Shapiro, who seem to proliferate on a lot of these platforms. But I would also say they have complaints about these companies, but not so much when it comes to bias. But they have concerns about harassment, about people being funneled into extremists groups, whether that's jihadists or white supremacists, and they have concern about bots and foreign infiltration, especially after the 2016 election with Russian interference. So those are more of the left wing kind of complaints.
I feel like we're kind of in a weird moment right now because we have Republican senators like Ted Cruz and we have Elizabeth Warren on the other side who agrees that Section 230 is bad. Are you worried that all of these attacks on Section 230 might lead to the government implementing speech codes on the internet and terminating the freedom that has been existent for the past 25 years?
I do worry about that. However, at the moment, the left and the right can't seem to agree on the nature of the complaint, so I haven't seen any kind of legislation that would be able to pass. However, we should remember that Section 230 was amended only a few years ago uh, in order to make an exception for content associated with human trafficking. And that is, I think, telling for a few reasons. But one is that it's very difficult to stand up for a law when there are those out in the public saying that that law protects human traffickers. Right? It's very an uncomfortable position to be in. And now
Mhm.
we're in a situation where you have senators who are talking about legislation that would tackle child abuse imagery, and the law would basically, the bill would make Section 230 protections contingent on taking steps to address the spread of that imagery. And that's the kind of, I think, the kind of strategy that could see Section 230 amended without a robust defense of Section 230, because lawmakers across the country are going to be asked, well, why would you be against a law that makes it harder for people to abuse children? That's the kind of rhetoric that I think does quite well in Washington, despite the fact that, of course, you know, no moral person wants to make it even appear like you're defending that kind of behavior, of course, but
Hmm.
those who are angry about Section 230 are certainly hooking onto that kind of content. Keep in mind when the human sex trafficking amendment to 230 passed in the Senate, there were only two votes against it. One was Senator Ron Wyden, who was actually one of the authors of Section 230, and the other was Senator Rand Paul, who was maybe flexing some of his libertarianism there. But it's that was very popular. It overwhelmingly passed the Senate, and so I do worry that when it comes to some kind of content like that kind of child abuse imagery, I think you could see there to be a real push. So you say that you're targeting child abuse imagery, but then you also throw in complaints about bias and harassment. You have a cocktail that may result in a nasty Section 230 hangover.
So it's just a fear that congressmen will use these seemingly positive movements forward to add random things that.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think there's in the wake of a panic or upset about all kinds of different things, you'll find that lawmakers take advantage of that. And there are a lot of lawmakers who are understandably very upset that uh, people across the world abuse children and use the internet to share images of that. And obviously, that's horrific behavior. And during a hearing on this issue, Senator Lindsey Graham told an Apple representative, "Look, if you don't fix it, we will." And that's the kind of rhetoric I'm now used to from Congress, which is you big tech companies, you need to just nerd harder and fix this problem. And it raises all kinds of difficult questions about encryption and privacy and how to safeguard children in the digital age. But I do think that amending Section 230 to address that problem would be a mistake.
Hmm. You wrote recently in a blog piece published at Cato at Liberty that, quote, too often we think of the freedom of speech to be a freedom that protects speakers from government censorship, and while the freedom to speak is necessary is a necessary condition for a functioning liberal society, it's not the only freedom implicated in what people refer to as the freedom of speech.
Mm-hmm.
The freedom of speech entails a freedom for publishers and platforms to associate with whomever they want, end quote. And then you write, quote, companies to disassociate from speech that they consider harmful is especially important during the current crisis. Social media companies have implemented a variety of policies aimed at dealing with COVID-19 misinformation, end quote. Many people see these practices as awful. Can you explain what you think about this issue?
As it relates to COVID-19 in particular?
Yeah.
Well, right. It isn't a surprise that as the pandemic worsened, that many social media companies decided that they would have to come up with policies about COVID-19 misinformation. They were in a situation where a lot of users were spreading information that the companies thought was potentially deadly. And many people were saying that this was a form of censorship. And my point in that article was to highlight that the freedom of speech is fundamentally a freedom of association issue. And the reason why that's important is you should be free to associate with whoever you want. And if you are working at the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times and a neo-Nazi submits an op-ed, you should be free to reject that op-ed. That doesn't mean that the neo-Nazi can't write the article and he can try and get it published elsewhere, or he could publish it on in his basement and hand pamphlets around. It doesn't implicate the neo-Nazi's actual freedom of speech. And if a social media site wants to engage in similar disassociation, that's I think a freedom that we should respect. It's important for private companies to be able to disassociate and associate with whomever they want. And my point with the COVID-19 piece was that we should consider that an important freedom. The freedom of Facebook to decide what kind of content it wants its business to be related to. And look, you can have criticisms of these policies. I don't want to make it sound as if I'm defending, Facebook or Google or YouTube per se. All I want to do is to defend their right to make decisions, and those decisions will be good and bad. But ultimately, when it comes to something like the COVID-19 pandemic, it's understandable why companies would want to take the step to limit access to certain content.
And what I always think about is that if you don't like the associations that a certain company has made, you could always disassociate yourself with them. Even if it's like Twitter or something, you could still do it if you really wanted to. But to each his own. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that's right. You sometimes hear people say that these companies are monopolies, and I just reject that view as self-evidently uh, ridiculous. But there are a trove of different avenues for people on the internet to post their thoughts and comments. I can't think of a legal piece. There's not a legal piece of writing out there that can't find a home on the internet somewhere. And in fact, there's plenty of places where illegal content is posted. But if you have a radical political position, there are places on the internet to post that idea, to discuss it, to try and spread it. The fact that it's not allowed by a private company that might be one of the largest doesn't implicate or damage your freedom of speech in the least. And some, especially conservatives, don't like to hear this, but Twitter and Facebook don't have an obligation to host your content, and you are still nonetheless free to try and find a home for it. I do worry that people oftentimes confuse market dominance with monopoly, but those are two very important. Those are two very different things.
Mm-hmm. So, kind of leading up to my final question, just as a conclusion of the main Section 230 part of this interview,
Mm-hmm.
what you've already kind of addressed in a bunch of your answers, but I want to kind of get a recap. What is a good picture of everything that we would lose if Section 230 would be removed?
Absent Section 230, if it was just full on removed, you would see the end of user generated content, by which I mean uh, tweets, Facebook posts, event pages, consumer reviews, uh, marketplaces like Amazon where people sell things, Etsy. That would all be a thing of the past, and that's because if websites were liable for any piece of third party content that was posted, they would have to screen every single piece of uploaded content before it went live, and that's just too expensive and impossible to do. So I don't think people should be calm about the potential risk here. If there's significant amendment or repeal of Section 230, the internet as we know it at the very least changes dramatically, and at worst ceases to exist. I don't think full on repeal of Section 230 is really on the cards. What I
Mhm.
imagine is there will be numerous proposals, amendments to it, but it's certainly important to consider how valuable we all view third party content. I think the internet is made better by anyone with an internet connection being able to contribute to discussions at many different avenues on the internet. But absent Section 230 or protection like it, it would be a very, very different internet.
Without consumer reviews, how are we going to find out anything about the food we're eating or the clothes we're buying? I
Well,
mean,
that's
I
right.
feel
Yeah.
like it would be a shot in the dark, and then, like, who wants that? I feel like it makes everything better, I
Hmm.
think. So, I think it's important.
Yeah, I do too. And look, that there will be people out there who will say, "Well, what's so great about social media anyway? It's a horror show." And to them, I say, I think it's very easy to highlight the bad stuff on social media, but I think it's the net benefits far outweigh the net harms. And I would also say that at least I think that the emergence of social media is the greatest revolution for speech since the invention of the movable type printing press. And we should consider that, and we shouldn't let momentary frustrations win the day in those kind of debates.
Yeah, I think that's good. So, finally, what is one thing that you believed at one time in your life that you later changed your position on and why?
Yeah, it's a good question. I've changed my views about a lot, and Actually, maybe that would have been a good answer to the first question. Is people your age should consider that you could be wrong sometimes. So when I was 17, I had very different political views than I do now. And so that's meant that a lot of my views have stayed the same politically, but I would say that when I was 17, probably the one that would be most jarring to friends of mine at the time, and even perhaps some family members, is at the time I was very, very anti gun rights and thought that only the cops and the military should be allowed to have guns. Although I've always actually, I should mention, be skeptical. I'm skeptical of police being armed anyway, but certainly private gun ownership was something I was very skeptical of, and I've come around to believing that private firearm ownership it should be legal. I didn't come to that because of any discovery about the Second Amendment or anything like that, but I read quite a bit of history about the history of gun ownership, especially in the African American community, and I've through reading and research and meeting gun owners, talking to them, and engaging in more debates, come around to the view that private gun ownership should be legal. So that's probably one of the biggest issues that I've changed my mind on the most in the last couple of decades.
That's really interesting. And I also think challenging your beliefs all the time. I mean, that's how we grow. So
Hmm. Yeah.
I like I like having discussions where people don't agree because then I have to actually think about what I believe and like
Hmm.
argue with them with something that actually holds ground. And
Yeah.
then that's where you find out, I don't know, anything. You find new stuff, old stuff. I don't
Hmm.
know.
Yeah. Something. I think I really benefited from going to university and studying philosophy, where there was no such thing as uh, an obvious truth, and that questioning everything and making sure that everything was grounded really prompted me to reassess a lot of my views, not just on politics, but also religion, economics, science. I mean, views changed in a lot of different fields for me. But I certainly, in the context of public policy, my views on guns is probably the one that is most jarring to people who knew me as a teenager.
Thank you so much for having this conversation with me. I
No, thank
learned a
you.
lot. I hope that my listeners learned a lot. I mean, I think this is such an extensive topic and it's not even that many words and it's not complicated to understand, but it's still, you have to go so deep because there's so much there. And
Hmm.
it's really interesting. So thank you so much for talking to me. And yeah,
No, well, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. Yeah, just send me a link when it goes live. I'd love to listen to it.
yeah, of course.
Great.